Jon Entine is the executive director of the Genetic Literacy Project. He's the author of numerous books on genetics and also food and farming. As a journalist, he won numerous honours. He has a reputation for tackling some of the most controversial issues without fear nor favour. For example, both he and I were involved some years ago, rather a lot of years ago, in the corporate responsibility world, and he was the first person who made a stir by pointing out that the ethical darling The Body Shop might not be quite as ethical as it was cracked up to be. Jon Entine, welcome. Great to see you, sir.
Thank you. Really pleased to be on the show and a longtime fan of your work.
Thank you very much. Jon, you've been on something of a journey. What would you say were the pivotal moments that have sort of brought you to where you are now?
I think that the sensibility, how one approaches the world and news is really the framing issue in my life. And I developed a skepticism about accepted wisdom. I'd say in the late 80s. I'm a lifelong journalist. I'm almost 70 years old. I started my career in television, network television news in the United States with ABC Network and NBC Network. And I think I was a traditional liberal journalist of that era, generally skeptical. As a journalist, I think that attracts people like me. But I actually wasn't always critical about the waves of ideology that wafted through the world, and I think is even more pronounced today. And I think the awakening came, oddly enough, with the documentary that I did with Tom Brokaw back in 1989, focusing on the genetic differences between blacks and whites, and why blacks have come to at least appear to be so dominant in certain sports, obviously not in others. And is this a cultural phenomenon, or is it partly biological and ancestral? I'm not sure that documentary would ever be made today. It ultimately turned into a book that I'm not sure would ever be published today, but the documentary was the highest rated, most awarded documentary of the year, and the book was a bestseller. So I got it in under the wire before political correctness has swamped our ability to take up controversial subjects.
And presumably you think that the content of that book, I mean, I'm sure there might be one or two things you'd correct now from all those years ago, but presumably you still think the content of the book is as valid today as it was?
Yeah, what's interesting about the book is that it's maybe 2/3 about why we're afraid to talk about genetics, which is the subtitle of the book that came out in 2000, Taboo, Why Black Athletes Dominate Sports and Why We're Afraid to Talk About It. So the sports and the science is part of the debate, but it's much more fascinating is the why of the debate. How have we misframed the issue? And when people use terms like race, that's being very simplistic, when notions of ancestral heritage mean much more. I mean, there's a reason why there are no Inuit Eskimos who are playing center in the NBA. They don't have the ancestral biological makeup. And if you suddenly, transplanted a Nome, Alaska family to Miami for 10 generations and they all intermarried, they still be short and squat. So when you reframe it in terms of ancestry and you talk about how more simplistic ways of discussing issues like that have polluted the debate, you have a much richer, more nuanced thing. And I think that's why the books have stood the test of time, because we're still debating what race means and what gender means and issues that are always going to be prickly. So how you discuss these issues is actually more important than the facts themselves.
And we're in a particular moment with the remarkable last couple of years that we've had. We spent the last couple of years being told to follow the science. Are we following the science when it comes to genetics? And if not, why not?
Good question. Science, I think people misunderstand what it is. Science is not a set of hard facts. It's a method of inquiry. The beauty of science is when new facts emerge, you have the courage to follow new hypotheses and sometimes totally reverse, not just alter your views of certain things. And that's what's been lost, I think, in the debate over recent years is a belief that science is a set of views. And I could take it on the left and the right, for instance, on issues like nuclear energy. Nuclear energy was a canonical issue in the 1970s and 80s, and then after Chernobyl, it was, people who are progressive won't support nuclear energy under any circumstances, because look what could happen. The world could blow up like it did in the former Soviet Union. The reality of it is, the facts have changed, the technology has changed. And if you revisit this with the Greek spirit of epoche, if you've ever heard of that, you want to divorce yourself of pre-prejudices on this and say, what are the facts now? That's what science is. And I think we've lost that flexibility to constantly re-examine our own views and alter them, sometimes significantly. And that's totally overwhelmed the debate over biotechnology and crops, let's say, where initial concerns have been overwhelmed by an amazing volume of fairly incontrovertible evidence, and it's time that we kind of let's get with the program. What are the possibilities now, and let's address that.
Do we see any new opportunities for that change to take place? Because on the one hand, it feels as though we're more polarized now, deeper in our bunkers than we've ever been. So where these things, as you say, they tend to come down to identity as much as they do about any kind of evaluation of the evidence. And it feels like that's as worse as it's ever been, worse than it's ever been. But on the other hand, then you have got issues like the pandemic, and you've got issues particularly now with climate change, where there are some real drivers to reevaluate some of it. So, for instance, could the EU get over its genetic phobia because of either the genetic makeup of the vaccines that it's been promoting, or indeed the requirements for adaptation on climate change?
I agree with you. Circumstances have changed, and it does cast things in a different light. The last few years have been particularly illuminating on a number of issues. People don't realize this, but the anti-vaccine movement was generally a right-wing movement. Was generally a left-wing movement for many, many years, out of the kind of fear of chemicals and a chemophobia that infects the left, a precautionary mentality that's very common in Europe, less so in North America, that basically says when there are risks, if we can't fully document the risks, then we always should err on the side of not taking those risks, which is not, interestingly enough, how the original precautionary principle was formulated. It was originally a cost-benefit analysis. That went out the window with radical leftism of the late 1990s and has infected European political ideology on science for many years. So I think catastrophes like we have experienced and are going through really gives us an opportunity to sit back and reevaluate everything. Here we have a slew of biotech-based vaccines. All of them are based on biotechnology advances, specifically the mRNA ones that have been most successful so far. And it's the exact same process that are used to develop GMO crops, and also the new generation of crops, and also biomedical advances, CRISPR gene editing. And so suddenly, it's interesting to see left-wing anti-GMO groups suddenly go silent on the issue of the inherent dangers of the technology. And suddenly they're now focusing on other issues and trying to be more and more obscure. And it narrows their base of opposition to technology that we know works and we know is quite widespread. So there is a bit of a silver lining, if you want to use that cliche, in these catastrophes now, in that it's all hands on deck. Let's re-examine all kinds of issues. Climate change is another example. As climate change becomes more severe, nuclear energy has to be part of the picture here, else we're not taking it seriously. We're just kicking things down the road and want to feel good. But if you're solution focused, all solutions should be filtered through the cost benefit analysis calculation machine.
Is there any evidence that the politicians, because of the last couple of years, are getting even remotely better skilled in evaluating or understanding some of these technologies? Because I gather that part of the problem in years gone past has been really the complete lack of understanding of what a lot of these technologies are about. Do we see any evidence of hope on that horizon?
That's an interesting question. So I'll be spitballing a little bit here based on what I see. What I do see, very heartening. I work a lot with think tanks, from the Brookings Institution and the Aspen Science and Society group on the left to Cato on the libertarian right, and even things like the American Enterprise Institute. And what I see is actually a much more of a confluence of recognition that these new technologies are game changers. And none of them really included the technological revolution, oddly enough, as part of their policy analysis. And from my experience on dealing with think tanks, and I've been involved with think tanks for over 20 years now, is that they are ahead of the politicians. The politicians are very reactive. Think tanks are reactive as well, but they're more attuned to actual developments. And when you get this change in the way this is being analyzed, and I've put together a consortium of left and right wing and middle ground think tanks on the issue of biotechnology, and there's much more consensus than there is division here, and that is very heartening to me. And I think the politicians will come around, let's put it that way, rather than lead this. I see Bernie Sanders, who's a nut. I mean, he's been an anti-GMO freak, and he's an anti-nuclear freak. I mean, he's a fossil of my generation. He's about my age, maybe a few years older. But people like him, who are true ideologues, well-meaning, heart in the right place, personally identify with a lot of his ambitious policy goals, are going to be overwhelmed by the new generation of my daughters who really engage these issues based on science. So the long term, I'm more heartened, and the crisis, I think, has made this more possible.
So if we see potential opening of the door for genetic technology, what do you think is going to be the aspect that most changes our midterm future? What's the most revolutionary change that's coming down the line for us?
I think what's going on now in biomedicine probably will have the most impact. We really can address diseases that were unaddressable. In my family, we have a genetic disorder because of my Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, a BRCA mutation that killed my mother, my aunt, my grandmother, and frankly, my sister as well. And I carry it. And my daughter, who is, she got the gene from me, not from her mother, is susceptible to it as well. The reality of it is that maybe that specific disorder may not be addressable, but others are and will be and are continuing to be. So that is remarkable in and of itself. From a climate change point of view, which I think is the challenge of our time, environmentally and otherwise, I'm very hopeful that we can address at least part of the problem using genetic advances, particularly the intense role that modern agriculture plays in contributing to climate change. There's no question. It's a huge factor. And now we have to decide, do we want solutions or do we want to feel good? If we want to feel good, then we adopt Britain's farm to fork strategy, which exports the problem to the developing world. They have to clear cut rainforests to supply Europe because Europe's food production cannot meet the needs of its people. So essentially they feel good, but the world and the climate change issue gets worse. Or do we want solutions where we can intensify agriculture, try to compress the negative impacts of it into a smaller and smaller area, increase food output, and do it by generating less carbon? And their technology is a solution. I'm not saying it all has to be biotech based. There's vertical farming. There's a slew of potential solutions. But we got to get our head out of the sand. And I have to say Europe's head is deeply embedded there.
Some would say you're being kind to say that their head was inserted into the sand, because I can think of one or two other places where I might have described it.
Yes.
I did a video a while ago talking about the insanity of a 25% target for organic agriculture for the EU. I mean, it just beggars belief of how you would think that was going to solve the problems that we're trying to solve. One of the areas that you've talked about on the genetic literacy website a lot has of course, been some of the early expressions of this in agriculture. So golden rice has obviously been a topic of some discussion. And that has recently had one or two modest breakthroughs. Is there progress being made in that area that is the beginning of the breaking of the dam, if you like, in terms of acceptability for the technology?
Yeah, I think one of the problems with biotech crops, GMOs specifically, when it first innovated back in the early 1990s, is that the perception was, I think, somewhat wrong, but understandably why this came out, is that the technology helped farmers and didn't help people as much. So farmers were more efficient in what they were doing. Obviously, there's some impact to the consumer in that, especially in the U.S. and Brazil and large countries that have adopted GMOs, they did see decreases in food prices, small but significant, especially to the poor. But now, partly because of advances in classic transgenic GMO technology, but also because of CRISPR gene editing, gene silencing, and other newer technologies, we actually see benefits that are clearly tangible. We see rice, as you mentioned, that has vitamin A built into it. So a staple that ends up killing people, filling stomachs, but destroying people's eyesight, suddenly becomes a net benefit. We have crops that are being grown in Africa, and 6 countries now in Africa have adopted GM despite heavy lobbying by left-wing activists in Europe, and that literally naturally attack the diseases that destroy anywhere from a quarter to a half of the staple crops of Africa. These are genuine advancements that people can see. And there's more and more. I mean, the potential with CRISPR technology combined with transgenics. We can't move away from transgenics. The Frankenfood label stigmatization will always be there. It's not a science-based one, but it's easy to stir up. I think we're entering a period where these technologies are now going to be recognizable by the general public. They're going to be clamoring for these things rather than just passively saying, well, okay, it helps my local farmer, not sure it's good for me.
It's hard to know, isn't it, just how it plays out, because what we have seen over the last couple of years is how the war over disinformation can make a real difference to perceptions, and particularly if it becomes politicized, or becomes even more politicized, maybe we should say, then what people understand and how close what they understand relates to the actual truth of the matter can be a very difficult to predict variable. And you could certainly see how, I suppose we foreshadowed the sort of debates we're now having over vaccines from all those years ago when we had those discussions about so-called Frankenfoods, where you had this whole perception that was built up from this very potent image that was put in people's heads that did or didn't necessarily relate a huge amount to the original technology.
Yes, I think we are in an interesting period. I do think the technology is so pervasive now that it really doesn't matter what public opinion wants. It's happening, and it's happening at lightning speed. We see it in medicine. Obviously, the vaccines, it is now embedded in biomedicine. So that debate is won in the biomedical. You have, in the United States, interestingly enough, and I think there might be that way in Europe as well, some of the most vociferous anti-GMO groups, like in the U.S., the Organic Consumers Association, or U.S. Right to Know, which is a creation of the Church of Scientology and the Organic Consumers Association, though people don't recognize its historical, financial, and other roots. They're now aligning themselves with the craziest anti-vaccine rejectionism of even COVID vaccines, which really makes it clear that these are purely ideological, technologically phobic groups, rather than ones who are advancing legitimate concerns about the misuse of technologies. And that's heartening. They're painting themselves into a corner that they'll never get out of, I don't believe.
I was struck by Jamie Metzl's book on hacking Darwin, when there was a particular section where he explained how inch by inch we were going to probably end up in a world where people routinely choose the genetic characteristics of their children. And there'd be a sort of upward spiral arms race of enhanced, all within human capabilities, but nevertheless choosing the optimally desirable characteristics for one's children. There's already evidence that, some countries such as China or so on may be doing that in relation to athletes and so on. Have you seen that argument about how that goes step by step? What do you think about it?
Yeah, it's obviously an argument we need to have, or discussion we need to have, because genetics now can actually change our evolutionary path. We can make some dramatic alterations about what we could be both for better and for worse. I think it's a bit futuristic right now. It's interesting and fascinating to talk about it, and appropriate to raise some of the alarm bells. But we're not there yet. I think we're probably 20 to 40 years out from that. What we're going to see is an ability on genetic mutations that are highly correlated with an actual disease. Huntington's disease, if you have the mutation for it, you have a 100% chance of getting it. Most diseases like the Ashkenazi Jewish breast cancer and pancreatic cancer mutations that affected my family members, the correlation rate is maybe 60 to 80%. So we're going to see more and more advances in those areas. I think it's going to come more slowly than the Jamie Metzel's book kind of makes it feel like it's coming. And frankly, we do have to keep up the observation viewpoint of all these things and be critical about it. I don't think it's something to fear. I think it's inevitable, and it doesn't really matter if we think it's something to fear, because as you mentioned, there are either going to be countries with the ability to do it and less restrictions like China, or rogue states that could do it. Especially the technology is very it's really part of the proletariat right now. Anybody can use these. You can do it in a college laboratory or a high school laboratory in some cases. So I think I'm less concerned. I think the debate will unfold, and the reality of it is we can't avoid it. So the issue is how do we harness this, not how we block it.
Yes, and you mentioned earlier the issue around the precautionary principle and how this is used in the public policy space around, I mean, not that issue specifically, because that's a fairly distinctive thing, but a lot of these other areas that we're talking about. And again, it's one that I've talked about as well. What is your take on why do you think the precautionary principle is not fit for purpose for an institution like the EU, which swears that that is its guiding star?
I refer to the precautionary principle as the precautionary notion. It's not a principle. Principle has to be based on a set of agreed upon principles and grounded in some reality. When the notion was first advanced in the mid to late 1980s in Scandinavia, it was very unformulated. But the first iteration of it, in some UN meetings in the early 1990s, the 1991 protocols, it was not a bad guiding philosophy. It basically said that we recognize that we don't know the impact of innovation. Innovation could have consequences that we can't always anticipate. And so before embracing an innovation, we need to do some kind of cost-benefit analysis to see if the risks of not doing it are just as are such that we should proceed on something, even though there are inherent risks to it. That seems to me an utterly important guiding philosophy. It's just become encrusted with politics and been used as a tool by, I would say bluntly, anti-technology left-wing activists that are rooted in the best of principles. I mean, my generation of acid-dropping, environment-embracing hippies is really the group that caused this. So the question is, can we navigate this, go back to the original iteration of it, rather than the way it's being embraced and, I think, erratically and dangerously, unprogressively enforced, particularly in Europe, but imposed on the United Nations and now infecting a lot of other countries' science philosophies as well.
I mean, my perception was always that ultimately it was a shield for people saying no to things that they wanted to say no to already.
Correct.
Whereas it would not be applied, not be invoked with the things that people actually wanted to do. And that may be an overly simplistic, jaundiced view, I don't know, but that was how it seemed to me, that if you're going to say no to the one thing and the implications were equally dubious, arguably, but that was never a factor in how these things were worked out. It was purely an ability to say no to the novel technology, not as a way of evaluating risk between two courses of action.
I think that's very wise analysis, and very much think that is true. It's become an ideological tool, yet when originally conceived, and I think if applied as a guiding principle rather than as a rigid legal and regulatory schemata, it should be part of what we do. Frankly, it's basically it should be called the common sense principle rather than the precautionary principle, because we've always done cost benefit analysis and trying to weigh risks. But here it's become scleroticized, to probably mispronounce and create a new word, sclerotic, and it's ideological rather than rational at this point.
And what about how we talk about some of these issues in the popular discourse? So, for instance, you and I also have done similar content, although in this one I followed you, so I was quoting your article in Quillette, I think, at one point, on the so-called insect apocalypse and all of the issues that we'd seen in headlines over the last couple of years, particularly recently, because somebody has a book coming out. And you kicked back against the insect apocalypse, and I did likewise. What, from your point of view, was behind that issue, and why did you pick that up as something for something you wanted to focus on?
I think everyone should be concerned about the impact of technology on nature in general, and you look for canaries in the coal mine, and I think people have seen insects or bees as potential canaries in the gold mine, warning us about whether it's the impact of agriculture or climate change. So the overall idea of this is a good one, and I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The question is, who are the people behind it? What does their history suggest their motivations are? But even putting those things aside, what evidence are they presenting, and does it really hold water? And I think, for better or for worse, environmentalism has been driven by a kind of catastrophism. The idea the world is ending. It began with a population bomb and Paul Ehrlich's totally wrong assessment over what the crises were in 1970, proved utterly wrong. And when you look back on it, it's even laughable. And clearly, I mean, I felt that I read it for a freshman class in college and laughed at it then. And I was this lefty who had ended up dropping out of college to work for a far left candidate, George McGovern. So it just seemed like not a plausible argument. So the problem with the insect apocalypse is that the person who wrote it is someone who is a longtime anti-GMO activist and stumbled upon this issue literally by being one of 7 co-authors of an obscure paper that came out 2 or 3 years ago. And he became the spokesperson in the front for the paper, even though he was the least qualified one. And the paper was eviscerated in the entomology community. But because of his connections in the anti-GMO community, it got wings, especially in European publications like Le Monde and others, which are, I wouldn't call them leftists, I would call them kind of anti-science neo-Marxist organizations, and it just took wing. And I think this is really a front for attacking modern technology in agriculture. So if you read the book that's coming out by this guy David Goulson, who's the person I'm referring to, it's some of the most sloppiest anti-GMO screed, with a little bit about the pending insect apocalypse, which doesn't hold in the entomology community. So I guess what I'm appalled by is not only the book itself and the movement that exaggerates these issues. There you go. I'm stopping that noise here. Is the appalling handling of this issue by the press. The New York Times slapped this on the front of the New York Times Magazine. 900,000 people read it. Its circulation and reaches to 35 million people. And suddenly a far left extremist hypothesis that was kind of rejected in the entomology community becomes mainstream media narrative, and other people, all they do is put a link on their articles to the New York Times, and they feel like they've done their due diligence. So my goal in the Quillette article, and we repeated in the GLP, was let's unpack the evidence. I think anyone who reads it, they may not agree with it, but it's very transparent in analyzing the information. I think it's thoughtfully presented in a non-ideological way, and at least it gives you a different framework for coming to your own conclusions and explorations about an important issue.
And I got some kickback from one or two people who are sort of in the ecology community, if you like, from that video that I did on that topic, because they argued that kicking back against one or two media headlines that were more apocalyptic in their nature was less of a service than what they were saying was that we gave the impression that there was no problem. I mean, you started off by saying you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They were saying, well, by kicking back against these apocalyptic stories, actually what you're really doing is you're saying to people, there's nothing to worry about, there's no problem at all. You know, for them, it seemed that the overblown headlines were much less of a problem than people suggesting that there was no reason for concern with regard to insect numbers. What would you say in response to that sort of critique?
I don't think that's a serious criticism. That's it's the typical reaction of people who can't respond to a reasoned and thoughtful analysis, the kind that you use for all of, I think, that I've seen in all of your analyses. But both of our approaches to this were reasoned. I thought we presented both sides. We also said we didn't say that there wasn't an issue, a serious one. But the constantly calling, claiming there's a fire in the movie house ultimately leads to people dying in a movie house when there is a real issue. I think one of the reasons people have not responded, taken a long time to respond to the climate change issue, is because of the hysterical way that it's being framed. It is a serious issue. We have countries like India and China that are going to be linked to coal for 30 or 50 years. You can jump up and down all you want and bleed at Beijing to suddenly transform themselves into a wind and solar energy system. It's not going to happen. The question is, how do you deal with the real world that exists, move public opinion, which is like an iceberg. It moves very, very slowly. Or do you want to feel good? And I think the critics here want to feel good. They want to feel like they're on the side of the right, of correct. And they are focusing in the right direction, but tactics matter. And if you blow the tactics, you lose the base. And I'm concerned about moving the base, not feeling good. And they're doing it utterly wrong and have no real grasp of how human behavior works in the real world and political behavior works.
Yes. And because of the topics that you take on, and because of some of the technology and how controversial it is that you're talking about, you have attracted your fair share of critics, and would say more than your fair share of critics. And one of the most common things, inevitable, I suppose, in this sort of area, is people will accuse you of being a corporate shill, and you're there to speak on behalf of the big, the Monsantos of the world and so on. You've obviously had that thrown at you a lot. What's your response to those sort of criticisms?
I think anyone who looks at my history knows that it's absolutely absurd. I mean, climate change is probably the most serious issue of our time. And I don't think a week goes by that we don't have 5 stories talking about climate change, but also proposing solutions for it. I just think that's the cheapest form of attack. If you have really serious issues with what I'm saying, absolutely, let's get a discussion out there. And if I made a mistake, let's revise it. I can't pay attention to people whose source of criticism is, we don't like who your grandmother married. That's not serious engagement on issues.
Yeah. So over the next 10, 20 years, if things go as well as you would hope that they would, where do you think we will be, and where do you think Jon Entine specifically will be?
I think hopefully I'll be a granddad to my daughter's kids and writing occasional articles here and there. But I guess I'm a mix. I mean, I live in the United States, which is politically divided. Trumpism is a disease, and it's getting worse. I'm not optimistic about the political future over the next 10 years. I think the Democratic Party is in disarray between fossils and some of the most interesting people are the least practical and are totally out of touch with how politics works in the real world. So I'm not optimistic in that sense. I'm not such a science techno lover that I believe science will solve all problems. But I do believe that we're headed in the right direction in addressing some of the most serious issues in the world, which are climate change and the role of agriculture and also biomedical challenges. So overall, I guess the big picture is I'm optimistic about the way things are going, but boy, is it a messy world out there. And with social media and the ability to even the most crazy cranks to get a voice in this current climate, I think it's going to be very, very noisy and a bumpy road. It's the good old days are generally past, even though I'm not sure there ever really were good old days.
Well, we're going to need all the more genuinely intelligent, critical voices we can get. So more strength to you and your organisation. It's been great to talk to you about all of this. Thanks very much indeed for your time, Jon.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to have been part of this discussion.
Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.